Hello. So, in this video, we're going to talk about Mbuh Tennu Mbuh's play, Who is Afraid of Mongo wa Swolenka. So this is a play from Cameroon, but the idea, the central sort of concern or theme of the play could actually be appropriate for any military, totalitarian, repressive regime, because basically what the play is about thematically is the danger posed by intellectuals to an autocratic leader. Or perhaps more accurately, the danger that autocratic leaders believe that intellectuals pose. Because I think there's actually, the basic idea of this is a repressive leader who's clamping down on intellectuals and things like this. It is what it is, but it's not especially interesting. But what I think this play does that's unique is it raises some questions about whether or not that threat is real, or whether this is the threat posed by intellectuals is simply a product of dictatorial paranoia. And so that's a really interesting question. And Mbuh Tennu Mbuh's play fits within a sort of larger intellectual or historical set of concerns about intellectuals being exiled from their home countries. Particularly under dictatorial regimes in Africa. This has been extremely common. People like Swolenka out of Nigeria, tons and tons and tons of South African artists and thinkers who opposed apartheid were exiled, etc., etc. So we've got this element here where we have His Excellency. He's referred to as His Excellency in the cast listing here. Although we do get his name at some point. I can't remember where it is off the top of my head. But anyway, so His Excellency is essentially military dictator, or sort of former military dictator former military, that is, in the way that, like, Nasser in Egypt was, Abaka in Nigeria was, Gaddafi in Libya. People who come out of a military background, but then take over as the sort of not necessarily military rulers of countries. So that's what we get with His Excellency. And then we have this character, Yasa, Nicodemus Yasa. He is an intellectual who is sort of betraying the plot of his fellow intellectuals to His Excellency. So His Excellency asks, "But tell me, who are these disgruntled beetles?" Yasa scratches his head. "My colleagues, Your Excellency, and most likely with non-intellectual, even diplomatic backup." His Excellency, triumphant. "Exactly. I knew all along. Unblinking prophet that I was born to be, seer beyond the steeled frontiers, just typical of all clowns and book slaves. Impish intellectualism, the gross humbug of the millennium, brandishing contrary and contradictory theories, embracing and stabbing each other, lame wakiri brain bugs, akunyams." I don't know what that means, I'm sorry. And then Yasa says conspiratorially, "You oversimplify the gravity of the situation, Your Excellency. They're no clowns and are certainly not clowning. Their minds tick like a clock and they're alert to every scratchy detail. The group calls itself Campaigners for the Salvation of Nubia Land. Their first plan of action is to campaign for the return from exile of our colleague, Professor Mongo Swolenka, and then he cuts off. But I'm not going to read any more of it. You get the idea here. So there's a couple of interesting things that happen in this passage. One is the assertion of the danger posed by intellectuals, and the fact that what the intellectuals want is the return of Professor Swolenka, who's been exiled for reasons that are really actually never discussed in the play. The fact that that is their big revolutionary goal, and that that's what's so threatening to the military dictatorship here, is really, really interesting, because it suggests that there is an actual danger. But at the same time, His Excellency characterizes these intellectuals as ineffectual, as sort of just having theories, just having words that often don't mean anything or are contradicted by their other words. And so it raises this interesting tension about whether or not there's an actual threat here, or whether or not this is simply His Excellency's paranoia. The other thing that's really interesting in that particular section, and we get this throughout the play, is that His Excellency continually characterizes himself through this hyperbolic religious rhetoric. So here he talked about himself as a seer. He talked about himself as a unblinking prophet. But in other places he talks about himself as the Messiah of the revolution and things like this. So it's an interesting idea, because actually in Africa, especially Central Africa, there have been a number of extremist Christian armies or paramilitary groups that have used a Christian rhetoric, typically a messianic Christian rhetoric and an apocalyptic Christian rhetoric, to justify horrendous crimes against humanity. But returning to this question of whether or not the intellectuals actually pose a threat, in Scene 3, we get a fairly lengthy speech from Chinwazu Nwapa, who is one of the intellectuals organizing this protest rally. We have this fairly lengthy speech from him. It goes on over 2 pages if you ignore the stage directions. It's an interesting speech because you get these sort of stereotypically academic phrasings. Let me see if I can... Okay. So, this sentence, for instance. The notion of Negroid existentialism, that is, the potential in this species to be subjected without complaint to all forms of frustration and humiliation, has baffled even the most ardent exponents of Basque Nazi Ku Klux Klanism, together with the pious faithfuls of a Jobian eternity. So I get what the sentence is saying, but it has that sort of academic flavor of, like, I'm using a bunch of unnecessary terms, a bunch of unnecessary jargon. And so we get that sense here. But ultimately, what the speech does is really not much of anything. It kind of just talks about the idea of, like, freedom and redemption and things like this, but it doesn't actually achieve anything. There's an argument to be made, I suppose, that part of the reason it doesn't achieve anything is because there is a government raid on the meeting and everybody is arrested. But we get the sense that it was never going anywhere. There was no there was nothing there. Like, they were going to ask for Professor Swolenka to be brought back from exile, but it's not clear what that would actually do or how that would actually improve anything in the country. And then there's one last bit I want to mention, because I think it's another really interesting turn in this question about whether or not the intellectual threat is real or whether it's just the paranoia of a dictator. Because in scene 4, Yasa has been arrested. So he was the informant early in the play, and he has now been arrested because there was a mistake. It was a mistake in the sense that Yasa had given information to His Excellency and the intelligence services about when and where this rally was going to be held, and the other, recognizing that he was a spy, the other intellectuals then changed the time and place without telling Yasa. So he gets arrested and tortured, basically. And Yasa says, "This is foul play, Your Excellency, hitting your own man beneath the belt without pity." And His Excellency responds, "Who draws the rules, Yasa? Am I not privileged to shift the goalposts as often as I see fit for the evolution of the game? That is, twist the law without breaking it?" And so this poses a really interesting sort of counterpoint to this idea of the intellectual threat. Because His Excellency can do what he wants. He has pretty much all the power. And so the threat posed by some intellectuals coming up with ideas seems like it's going to be extremely minimal. So I think it's a fascinating play, because I think it takes a very sophisticated approach to this question.